Ruslan.
Cameron, I don't know how much you know about me. It doesn't really matter. But what most folks hopefully have heard about me at this point is I came to the faith through the door of apologetics. I was at a young age hurt by the church, hurt by religion, hurt by the faith, because the church that we were attending, the Armenian Orthodox Church, had remarried my dad when I guess he was technically still married to my mom. So I grew up with a lot of church hurt, a lot of church pain, and fully functional atheist at a very young age. And Apologetics, and specifically Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, The Case for Christ. These are the books that brought me to the faith. And so that is why I fell in love with your channel probably close to about a year ago. I went and swiped up and looked at some of our earlier DMs. And it's been a huge blessing. So my question to you is, how did you get into apologetics? And what role do you think apologetics can play for bringing skeptics to the faith, or bringing, contextualizing the gospel for folks that are a bit more intellectual and heady?
Okay, I counted about 3 different questions there. Let me start with the one about my background, how I kind of got into apologetics. So on my channel, I talk about this a lot. My brother became an atheist about 8 to 9 years ago at this point, and that's really what set me on a journey to really discover whether or not I had good reasons to believe that Christianity was true. I remember having a discussion with him. I went over to his house, we had dinner, and I was going to talk to him about his atheism, because I didn't really take it seriously at that point. I had dealt with doubts myself while I was in Bible college, which I was only there for a year, and it wasn't a very serious Bible college or anything. It wasn't like a seminary. I wasn't learning theology or anything like that. It was very charismatic and just not very serious. But the point is that I had my own doubts, and I overcame those. And I was thinking, well, it's going to be super easy to just go talk to my brother and just convince him that Christianity is true, or his objections weren't any good. And it didn't go like that at all when I first met with him. So after that night, that launched me out into apologetics and to discover whether or not there was any good reason to think that Christianity was true. So when I talked with him initially, he had a lot of good objections. In my mind at the time, these were good objections because I hadn't thought about them myself. I didn't know if there were any good responses to them. But after a while, and what I mean by a while is after several years of looking into the evidence for God's existence and for Christianity in particular, I discovered that there's such a wealth of arguments and evidence out there that I didn't anticipate really being there. And so that's what really kind of encouraged me to get involved in apologetics, because I've figured that there's a lot of people like me who just didn't know this, even in the church. And so I see a whole lot of value in trying to get this information out there, basically. Now, what was the second part of your question? The other question was, is it valuable to get it out there?
No, what role do you think it could play in contextualizing the gospel for the skeptic?
So I think that apologetics can serve a couple different functions. And probably the number one function that it serves is to answer doubts for Christians who are already in the faith. And so evangelism is, I think, one goal that apologetics can serve, but it's not the only goal. But I think that for some people who are open, apologetics can play a significant role in their coming to, embrace the truth of Christianity. But I think for a lot of people, and this applies to not just atheists, but to Christians. And when you're kind of set in your worldview, you're not really open to hearing what other people have to say or viewpoints that contradict your own. You're not really open. And so in the same way that it applies to atheists, it applies to Christians and to Hindus and everyone else. When you're kind of set, you're not really open to hearing some kind of apology or philosophical argument for the truth of, for the fact that God exists or that Christianity is true. So I think that apologetics can play that function, but for a lot of people, they're just not open to it. And so for some people, it seems like yourself, you were open to it. You were open to following the evidence where it led, and that led you to embrace Christianity. So I think that for those types of people, it can definitely serve that function. But for the function that it served in my life was that it kept me a Christian. And I grew up a Christian. I had all of these experiences at church, and then when I encountered these really serious objections, apologetics is what helped me sort of answer those objections, and I'm now still a Christian. And so I would say if a lot of times I get asked, why are you a Christian? And so that's a little bit more difficult these days to answer that, because in the past, what I said, oh, well, that's kind of how I grew up, and that's basically it. Like, I just go to church, and that's why I'm a Christian. But nowadays, it's like, that's why I was a Christian. But the reason why I'm still a Christian is because of apologetics. But to answer your question, I think that it kind of depends on the person and whether or not they're really open to following the evidence where it leads, which I think in a lot of cases, just people aren't really open to doing that. I think it's a rare quality to be able to do that.
I love that. How has your relationship with your brother changed since you got more into apologetics? How has the conversations changed?
That is a good question. So at first, when I was starting to get into it, because when you first discover apologetics, it's like I had been living my life with blinders on, and like I took them off, and I was able to see the world in a completely different way. I was able to make connections between my thinking and what other people would say, and just in basic dialogue with other people, I was able to do and understand a lot of the moves that were being made. And so it just like, it opened my world, opened up my mind. And that's like when I started to learn these arguments for the truth of Christianity, I was like, these are good arguments. I need to share this with my brother, like at every opportunity that I can. And that's what I did. And what I discovered that was the wrong thing to do, because what I was doing was I was actually kind of treating him as like a thing to like win as opposed to a person to love.
Yeah.
And like, this is not just a person, this is my brother. And I wasn't really loving him. I was just trying to like win arguments, and try to win these debates with him, and try to like and use these arguments as a kind of weapon against him, as opposed to just loving him first. And so what I eventually learned was that I need to put all of that aside and focus on that first part, and then everything else can just kind of happen organically when it does. And so that's what I've really been focusing on these last few years, is just being there for him as a brother, loving on him. And then once I've got that down, then that can leave the door open to have these other conversations about, worldview stuff. And it's really been amazing to make that transition. Nowadays, when we have conversations, it's not combative. It's like, we can really approach these things, I think, with open minds on both sides. And it's just a way better approach. And I had to learn that the hard way.
That's awesome. One of my good friends, Rufat, was a very charismatic Christian who then became a very avid atheist. And I've caught flack on my channel for having him on. We have a series, and I think it's awesome to see brothers that disagree on some very foundational views of life. However, they can have a civil argument or a civil conversation. And I think you're totally spot on in terms of not trying to win the argument, but trying to love the person. And I think that I've won a ton of respect from a lot of my atheist friends, because they know that my faith isn't just something that's like, personal, abstract, what have you. It's a literal, physical faith. Would you say that most people come to the faith through an experience with God, like a transformative experience with God, and then apologetics, and the meaning of apologetics, those of you guys that are wondering, is ultimately the defense for the faith, right? It's defending the faith. Would you say most people come to the faith through an encounter, an experience with Jesus, and then apologetics kind of keeps them in the faith? Or would you think that it's a little different than that? What are your thoughts on like the role that it plays? Because it sounds like it kept you in the faith, but it led me to the experience, which is, I think, backwards than most people.
Yeah, well, let me say something that's kind of in the background here, because a skeptic might be listening to this and think that there's something wrong with that, with like apologetics being served as this kind of function to keep people in the faith. I actually made a video on my channel that said why I wish I used to be an atheist, because it makes it seems a whole lot more compelling when you can hear someone that say was a Christian, then became an atheist, and then became a Christian again, or someone who started out as an atheist, maybe even in your case, and then through apologetics or through the evidence, then became a Christian. But when you start with somebody who's a Christian and then they just like remain a Christian because of apologetics, it seems like there's maybe something not right that's going on there. And so, but I made this video, and the point there is I was kind of like thinking about why would I like to have used to been an atheist, you know? And so what I discovered was that it sort of gives an appearance of intellectual honesty to people, but that's not what I should be going after, right? I shouldn't want to appear a certain way to this group of people, to skeptics. That's not what I should be focused on. What I should be focused on in reality is just going after the truth. And so if that's what I've done, at least to, the best of my ability, and we all deal with cognitive bias, it's not just like a thing that happens to this one group of people,
right,
or people who, consider themselves God believers or whatever. It's not, it happens to everybody, including atheists. So yeah, I just think that we've got, that can't be the thing that we're trying to get after, like the appearance of intellectual honesty. We've just got to go and shoot for the truth. And so I think that that's what I've done, even though apologetics has sort of played that role for me. I think that that's what I've done. And I feel like I didn't even answer your question. So repeat your question real quick. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for making that point. What I was basically saying is like most people come to the faith through an experience, an encounter. An encounter and experience that could be kind of interchangeable, right? And I don't mean to just dismiss that as like an emotional thing. Oh, I felt God, I felt the goosebumps during a worship song, and then I knew, and then apologetics keeps them in the faith. Versus in my situation, it was kind of backwards, right? And so I think, I would say
go ahead. I'd say for most people, it's sort of based on an experience. At least if maybe at the first, and then maybe later on through apologetics, you could learn to embrace the faith because of these other reasons. You'd have William Lane Craig calls it like the technical term that he uses is called double warrant. So you've got this experience of God, or like when you read the Bible, it just seems true to you. And so you've got this kind of experience that way. But then you can also have this other kind of warrant, or this other kind of justification for your belief on the basis of some argument, on the basis of some evidence that you've encountered. So Christians, that's good. What he argues that you've got kind of double warrant there. But I would say like that's more of an empirical question. It's like, what do people, how do people normally come to believe that Christianity is true? Is it on the basis of experience, or is it on the basis of some argument? I'd say probably in the vast majority of cases, it's through some kind of experience, which I don't think that's a bad reason to believe at all. I'm what's called a reformed epistemologist. So I don't think that you need necessarily to have reasons for your belief in God in order for it to be justified. I think you can completely be justified on the basis of experience, because the way that I view it is that that's a kind of evidence. In the same way that if I say that I was to go outside and I was like trying to find something in my car, and I like slam my finger in the car door, which I think a lot of people have experienced something like that. You don't like that experience of pain is not something like, and you naturally form the belief in that situation. You're like, okay, I'm in a lot of pain, right? You have that belief, but that's not on the basis. You don't have that belief as the result of some structured argument. Okay, now I feel pain. Right. If I feel pain, then that's not how it works. Yep. You just have the experience and you find yourself with this belief based on your experience. I think that's a completely legitimate way of coming to believe something. So I just, to answer your question, I would say that for the vast majority of people, it's probably based on something like experience, which again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
What do you feel about, I haven't dug too deep on this, and I'm sure you've thought through it, but what do you feel about the pragmatic side of Christianity? I love your slogan. By the way, Christianity is true, right? So I think you're saying that from a historical standpoint, a philosophical standpoint. How do you feel about if we examine and just objectively look and say how much of the West has been influenced by Judeo-Christian principles, right? Equality, love your neighbor as yourself, all these ideas that we kind of take for granted until you go, to a totally different part of the world. You go to China, you go to parts of the Middle East, and you're like, whoa.
Or you just look back in history.
Yeah, or yeah, exactly. Or you just look back in history. And I think that maybe something we don't talk about enough is in the same way the apologetics of like defending the faith. The flip side of that is like, hey, if we live our life the way the scriptures encourage us to and instruct us to, it'll actually be in our best interest. That doesn't mean there won't be tragedy. That doesn't mean there won't be suffering. It just means that God's ways of things are always the best ways of doing things. And even when there is tragedy, when you have God's ways of doing things, you'll make sense of the tragedy.
That kind of reminds me, have you heard of Pascal's wager?
Yes, on your channel.
Okay. Yeah, what you're kind of getting at seems to be something along those lines. It's like it makes a lot of sense. Like if you were just to kind of make a decision based on what you know, and in terms of like weighing the risks and the benefits, the potential benefits and the potential costs, Pascal's wager is about like, well, if Christianity is true, I'm always really bad at actually laying out Pascal's wager, but there's a great person who I've interviewed on this, Liz Jackson, and a lot of skeptics online will be like, Pascal's wager is really bad, but it's not actually. There's some really good responses to some of the common objections to it. But basically, so if Christianity is true and you believe it, then there's potential infinite reward. In terms of like heaven, Yes. And if Christianity is true and you don't believe it, then there's potential really bad stuff. You could wind up in hell, depending on what your view of hell is on Christianity. I don't think that's really going to actually matter that much. That's something that Liz Jackson argues in her work. But then, so you have infinite potential reward and possibly on the other side, infinite potential punishment or bad stuff, bad consequences. Christianity is true. But suppose that atheism is true, let's just consider Christianity and atheism. Suppose atheism is true, and you believe in Christianity, then what are you really losing out on? Yes. Doesn't really seem like you're losing that much here. But suppose that atheism is true and then you believed in atheism, like what is there to gain there? It doesn't seem like you've actually won much either. So it seems like, given the fact that if Christianity is true, there's potential infinite reward or potential infinite bad consequences. Yes. And it seems like any rational person should want to believe that it's true, or at least, if not, you can't force yourself to believe something. You could at least commit yourself to, like, say, going to church or reading your Bible or praying. Yes. You don't have to actually. That's one of the common objections to Pascal's wager, is that you can't force yourself to believe something, and that's not necessarily what you have to do. You could just commit to living a Christian life. Yes. So yeah, I think does that kind of answer? No, that totally answers it.
Jordan Peterson says he lives as if God exists, yet he said he's unsure. He said he's agnostic on if the resurrection was literal or not, right? Which is really interesting to think that this, Jordan Peterson teaches all these classes and goes through the Bible and this whole thing, and then he's like, when he's pressed about the resurrection, he said, I'm agnostic on if it's literal, and I'm like, wow, that's really interesting that he would say that, yet live as if God exists and read the Bible and do all the Judeo-Christian values and virtues. So I think the way you articulated it as well, what's the upside, what's the downside? Right. I think anything, this is going to sound bizarre and atheists are going to hate me for this, but I think anything that we would find decent in human behavior in the West, regardless of what you believe about there being a creator or not, is actually Judeo-Christian principles, right? Love, kindness, patience, compassion. Do you think it's intellectually dishonest for atheists to conjure up their own morality while denying that there's a God, when the majority of our morality and everything we would call human decency comes from the notion of this Judeo-Christian God?
That's an interesting question. I need you to repeat it, though.
Yes. So everything in our society, my opinion, this is my opinion, but I think history would back this up.
Well, let me stop there, because there's a guy who I interviewed recently. His name is Tom Holland, and he's just recently wrote a book. I've got it on my bookshelf behind me. He wrote a book, and he's a historian. He's actually, I think he says that he's a Christian now, but he was for a long time, he identified as an atheist or maybe an agnostic. But on the basis of looking into the history, because he loved like the Roman period and like the ancient period in Greece, and he was like, as he was researching these different individuals, he was discovering that like they had completely different beliefs than he does, and in terms of like, what's moral and what's not moral. And he was like, how is that like? What they found is like, this is completely acceptable, he finds morally abhorrent, right? And he was like, it's just so foreign. It's like almost an alien living, and this wasn't that long ago. It was like 2,000 years ago, right? And so then he started to think about this more and more and more, and then he eventually wrote this book where he basically defends the idea that Christianity is the reason why we have these sort of Western values. So when you say that atheists are going to hate that or whatever, then why don't they just go and look at what this famous historian is saying, who wasn't a Christian?
Yep.
Like this is becoming more of a mainstream view. It seems pretty obvious that Christianity has a really serious impact into what we believe today.
On everything. On everything.
Right. Yeah. So a skeptic who wants to challenge that, you're going to have actually a really difficult time challenging that for real. So that I just wanted to say that at first, but continue your question, going back to.
So with that, we established that premise. Me and you agree that the majority of charity, of morality, of goodness, of equality, values that regardless on what someone may believe about if there's a creator or not, the majority of those come from a Judeo-Christian view, the teachings of the New Testament. Do you think it's intellectually dishonest for an atheist to say that they could have morality and dignity and decency without there being a God that pushes morality? And like they detach and they say, well, you don't have to believe in God to have morality, yet are they ignorant of the fact that the majority of everything that's decent about the West is because of this idea of a God and the way he prescribed us to live in the New Testament?
Yeah, I don't think it's got to be necessarily intellectually dishonest. What they could say is that, like, we've got these sort of roots that explain kind of where our values are at currently. But a lot of these atheists are what's called moral subjectivists. So they don't believe that there's some kind of like objective standard that determines what's right or wrong. Right. So they could just say, well, my moral beliefs were shaped by Christianity, or like, the Judeo-Christian tradition. It was shaped by that in very significant ways, but because I'm a moral subjectivist, it doesn't really, matter all that much. I'm still just going to do whatever I want to do, and I have these beliefs, but it doesn't mean that I'm subscribing to some like objective moral standard. So that's one way that they could go. And another way that they could go, if they want to say that morality is objective and that there are sort of objectively true moral facts or moral claims. So like they would believe it's always in every circumstance wrong to torture an infant for fun. And even if someone disagreed about that, then they would just be wrong. It's not like this person would just have a different preference or different taste. Like, you can think about it like different tastes in ice creams, right? Like I like vanilla ice cream. My son likes chocolate ice cream. And there's not really, some objective standard to determine who's right in this case. Right. But a moral objectivist would say that there is a right and wrong answer to these kinds of moral questions. So then the question is, could an atheist be intellectually honest and also accept that morality is objective? And that's a very serious question. That there's an argument for God's existence called the moral argument. It's a very, very creative title. But it basically goes like this. Premise number one: if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Come on. Premise two: objective moral values and duties do exist. And then the conclusion follows via something called modus tollens, for any philosophy geeks out there, that God exists. That's the conclusion that follows from the two previous premises. So what we're kind of discussing right now is whether or not premise one is true. And I'll just repeat that premise. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Yeah. And I think that there is very serious debate over whether or not that premise is true. So there are very prominent defenders of this argument, defenders of this premise, like William Lane Craig. He defends this argument pretty famously. There's another guy who's really, really good that's not as well known. His name is David Baggett. His moral argument is actually a lot different. He doesn't do this kind of like rigid, logical kind of argument. It's more, and I'm going to use a little bit of a technical term, philosophical term. He has an abductive argument. But so there's my only point here is that this is a very controversial premise. And personally, I don't think that premise, or I guess a better way of saying it is that I'm just kind of undecided whether or not that premise is true. So I think that it's at least plausible that an atheist could be a moral objectivist is what I'm saying here. So I don't think that it's necessarily dishonest or intellectually dishonest for an atheist to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. That's good. I've heard it said if somebody can argue into the faith, someone else can argue out of the faith, right? Which is when people ask me to do more apologetic stuff on my channel, I just say, hey, just go check out Capturing Christianity, right? Because I'm not trying to argue people into the faith, and neither are you, but I think you have just really well laid out arguments for the faith, the claims for the faith. So I appreciate you doing that. And you guys should definitely check out his channel. Even the front page is just like the I think it's evidence for the resurrection, right? Like, and I'm like, I'm in, right? So I've binged a lot of the content. And what I appreciate about you, Cameron, and we can kind of shift gears a little bit in terms of how you got into YouTube, is you come from a photography background. And one of the things that's very noticeable about your channel is just how ill your whole backdrop looks, your lighting, the aesthetic, the colors. And you this is a passion of yours. You curate, you bring on a lot of other guests. Tell me a bit more about how you got into YouTube, and let's unpack that a lot, because I got a lot of questions for that, and there's a lot of aspiring creators that are going to be watching this. So how did you get into YouTube and your background as a creative?
Great question. So I started my ministry, and it is a nonprofit, like we're a registered nonprofit ministry. It's but I started it as a blog. So it's capturingchristianity.com, and I was blogging a whole lot. And the reason why I did that actually was because as an apologist, or as an aspiring apologist, I would go to the Reasonable Faith forums, which is Dr. William Lane Craig's website. He's got a forum set up on his website. And I was spending hours and hours and hours there debating atheists, like every single day, checking it at night, checking it in the morning, checking it in the middle of the night. And so eventually I decided, okay, look, if I want to get serious about apologetics and like actually try to, make something out of this, even if it's just a blog or something, or maybe write a book one day, then I need to get serious about it. So I started Capturing Christianity, my ministry, as a blog. And then eventually it turned into a YouTube channel. But to kind of talk about the photography side, so my background is photography. I was a professional photographer for, I think, 7 years. And I was a photographer at a very pretty famous retailer. If you look into my if you like search Cameron Bertuzzi photography, you might be able to find it. But anyways, so I was a photographer for this retail company, and when I was starting my blog, I was thinking photography doesn't seem to lend a whole lot of credibility to me what does a photographer know about philosophy or about history or about theology? But eventually I decided I just need to be myself. I need to embrace photography and just incorporate that into apologetics. And so everything that I do is going to reflect, myself, my past, and who I am, and the things that I'm passionate about. And so I just decided that I don't care. People don't take me seriously because they think that I'm a photographer or whatever. I'll let my work sort of speak for itself and then embrace who I am. And so, but the way that I got into YouTube was eventually I was like, okay, well, maybe every now and then I'll like go out somewhere and record an interview with somebody and just do that. And so one of the first interviews that I did was with a guy named Tyler McNabb, who I live in Houston, and he lived in Houston as well, which was kind of interesting. I learned that he was here, but I went over to his office. He's a young guy. He's actually younger than me. He got his PhD in like record amount of time. It's ridiculous. He's super young, super intelligent. I went over to his office, set up two little cameras, and I just hit record. And then later I came back in my little studio and did some video editing and stuff. And I posted that in 3 parts on my YouTube channel. I was not taking YouTube seriously at this point. I never thought of myself as a YouTuber. I wasn't trying to like get into YouTube. I was just like, well, this kind of serves the same purpose of like what I'm doing with my blog and my website, and I can do this kind of thing, and whoever sees it, that's cool. I don't really care. And so that was my attitude getting into YouTube. And then continuing my relationship with Tyler, like he and I became friends, and I was like, well, what if I set up a debate on my YouTube channel? This was back when Google Hangouts, you could still use Google Hangouts to do interviews and stuff. And so I just invited a whole bunch of people on to talk about this argument, this very esoteric argument it's not even for God's existence, but it's against naturalism. It's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. But I just decided to set this video up. I'm going to have these various people on that I knew and that I had engaged with on Facebook and everything. So there was a guy named Stephen Law, who I invited, and then Tyler McNabb, and I was going to have them talk, and then all these other people could just talk. Anyways, so the point is that at the end of this, after I did this, I was like, this was actually really fun. Like, I could do more of these. And so that kind of sent me to do dialogues like that on my channel about once a month. And so I've continued doing that. I still host debates and still host dialogues between Christians and non-Christians on my channel. And so that kind of got me more interested in doing YouTube. And then eventually there was a guy named Mike Winger, who is just, you probably know about him. And if your audience doesn't know, Mike Winger, definitely got to go check him out. But he's such a great guy. And he reached out to me on Facebook several times, even back when my attitude towards YouTube was like, I don't care about it. I don't want to do this. Yeah. And he was like, because he was actually doing really well on YouTube at the time. And he had his channel for probably 6 or 7 years at that point. So he had learned a lot. And he was willing to just share all this information with me. And I was like, nah, I don't really want to do that. It's not really my thing. I don't really want to do that kind of thing. But eventually he convinced me. He was like, okay, let's do this like collaboration between John McCrae, Mike Winger, and myself. And so we took a video from an atheist that was about 2 minutes long. It was called 20 atheist arguments against God's existence, or something like that. And so each of us took one of these arguments, and we made a short response video to it, and we made it part of a playlist. And so it was a collaboration. And so overnight, my YouTube channel went from about 1,500 subscribers to 4,000 subscribers. Yeah. And once I saw that jump, and the fact that these videos were getting thousands of views, I was like, this is a whole lot more views than my blog has ever received. There's a whole lot more potential here. You can even make money on YouTube. It just made a whole lot of sense. And with my background and photography and video, it's like, this just makes a lot of sense. And so at that point, I decided, okay, I'm going to get really serious about this. And so from that point on, I've just, like I said, been very, very serious about doing YouTube. So that's the kind of short-ish version of my.
At what point did you infuse your photography skills into YouTube? Because I saw some of your earlier videos and you're just kind of using like a Logitech webcam. But at what point did you start like the modern presentation that you have right now? And by the way, I'm sorry, because this is my LUT is butchering your LUT, and I didn't have time to fix it, so you're probably gonna hate the way this looks on YouTube. But when did you introduce the aesthetic that so many people kind of know you for now?
I would say probably a little over a year ago. Okay. I was trying to figure out how I could up my, so doing live streams, you've got to figure out how you can get like a good camera. So my interview with Tyler was actually filmed on 2 DSLRs, and that looked really nice, because it was filmed on these really nice lenses and cameras and stuff. And then in post, and I just edited the whole interview together. And so that's the way that I did that, and it looked really good from sort of early on. But to do interviews is a whole different beast, as you're probably really familiar with at this point. And so the easiest way to do that is just to use a webcam, to get some little cheap microphone and do it that way. But I was like, okay, I need to eventually step my game up. But I very easily discovered that it requires a whole lot of money in order to do that. The cameras that I had at the time didn't support doing like a cam link, or like converting some kind of HDMI signal into something that a computer can recognize like a webcam. My really nice cameras that I used for photography couldn't do that. And I realized that I had to like invest money to be able to do this. And so eventually, as a ministry, I started a campaign to raise funds to buy a nice camera. And so eventually that's what I did, is I bought a camera that can do this kind of thing. And then also with a microphone as well. And so I would say probably about 1.5 years ago at this point. I'd have to look into the archives, see exactly when that happened, when I got a nice camera, a mirrorless camera that could do the make it look really nice and lights and stuff. Because I already knew how to do all the settings as a photographer, like the settings and the lights and everything like that. That was the easy part. The difficult part was figuring out how to do that live as a live stream. But eventually I figured it out, and it just took some money to be able to do that. Yeah,
and I think what I'm kind of getting at is that you skill stacked, right? You took your skill of photography, you stacked it with your passion for apologetics and your ability to write and to have a blog. You combine these things, and it allowed you to be disruptive as a creator in this space. And I think sometimes it's that obvious. What are some things that you're good at? What are some things that you're passionate about? What are some things that you can piece together? My background is in music, right? So I started doing a live streaming, reviewing people's music because I had a platform as an artist. That positioned me to improve my equipment. Like the revenue from that positioned me to improve my equipment. As I improved my equipment and my subscribers grew, I was able to get more high profile guests, which then grew my YouTube even faster and faster. And so I think people miss this idea of skill stacking, where you're combining multiple things on top of each other to create something special. And that's what, again, kudos to you, because your channel is very like disruptive to me. Like when I saw from the thumbnails to the content, and most importantly, it wasn't you being an expert as an apologist. It was you curating your passions. Talk about that for a minute. Like, how intentional was the curation portion of it? Because it's not positioning Cameron as the know-it-all on this topic.
Right.
You were actually interviewing people that were heavy hitters in this space, but maybe they weren't on YouTube. Maybe they didn't have a really good looking interview and a polished interview. And you're creating these amazing interviews for folks that are academics and very smart. So just talk about how you were able to curate and how important that could be for some people.
Yeah, so early on, I had a few different people that were talking, or that were helping me kind of shape what the future of capturing Christianity was going to look like. And eventually I decided, okay, look, like, I'm not an expert. What I am is a photographer. I have a very intense passion for this stuff, but that doesn't make me an expert. I think a lot of people kind of fall into that trap of thinking that, like, because you've read a couple books, you think that you're an expert and you can talk on the subject. And there's a lot of people. I mean, there's even I think Richard Dawkins is a great example of that. He's an expert in one area. Like, I'm an expert in photography. He's an expert in evolutionary biology. And then he tries to, like, pretend like he's an expert, or that people should listen to what he has to say when it comes to philosophy of religion. That's a complete mistake. Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. His arguments are awful. They're some of the worst arguments that have ever been put forward in the public sphere in terms of, like, religion and philosophy. So that's a real big trap. And so what I wanted to do was to acknowledge who I am, what are my limits, and then what can I do about this? And as a photographer, as someone who has an interest in this, what I can do is interview people who are the actual experts. Yeah, and so good. I could shape my channel to be more of a platform as opposed to like a personality type. And I think that those are probably the two main categories of apologetics ministries. So you have, like, Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig's ministry, is a personality type ministry, apologetics ministry. It is all about the work of William Lane Craig. And he's very careful to make that apparent and obvious and explicit. It's like this, all of it is about William Lane Craig's work. But there are other ministries, like I think not Reasons to Believe. I can't think. Are you familiar with Greg Koukl?
No. I know William Craig, but I don't know Greg Koukl.
Greg Koukl is there it is. Stand to Reason is his ministry. So that ministry is actually kind of centered around Greg Koukl, but he also has a bunch of other different speakers, and it's not called like Greg Koukl Ministries. It's called Stand to Reason, and he has a bunch of different people. So it's kind of a platform for these different people. But what I do is I interview experts, and that's the way that I stay in my lane. I'm not trying to get out. I'm not trying to act like I'm some kind of expert. When I do my own videos, like when I post a video, it's just me talking. Then I regularly defer to the experts. I reference all of this different work, and I even send my scripts to experts, people that I trust, and mentors that I've got, and philosophers. So I regularly am submitting my ideas and my work to the actual experts. And I felt like that was the appropriate way to go about this. It also keeps me humble. It doesn't, it's a way to keep, again, to just stay in my lane and to remember what are the best things about Cameron Bertuzzi that he can bring to this space. And I also just wanted to expose, I mean, that's the whole point of exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. What better way to do that than to just to interview all of these different experts that people probably haven't heard of, but whose work needs to be in the forefront and needs to be in the limelight. Yeah. And so that was my thought and reasoning behind why I'm more of a platform as opposed to a personality type ministry.
I love it. I love it. I think that. So what I like about what we're doing right now is we're describing what you've done. I want you have a video up right now that's like 7 tips for YouTubers. I watched it. I thought it was really good. And it was a collab with you and I forgot the other gentleman's
Matt
name.
Frad.
Yes. He has a super dope channel too. His aesthetic is crazy. His thumbnails are really dope. So you just gave us like, this is what Cameron has done. Can you, without rehashing the video you did with Matt, which you guys should all go watch if you're aspiring to get into YouTube, the Christian YouTube space, I think is thriving and I think it's awesome, all the diversity. Can you give us some now prescriptive stuff? Some these are some very practical things that if someone is watching this, they have some of these talents. Maybe they could skill stack a passion and a talent on top of each other to do what you're doing, what I'm doing. What are some very tangible pieces of advice you can give aspiring creators, Christian creators?
Yeah, so I would say definitely go check out the video that you referenced. We just recorded it. Was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday.
I think it came out yesterday.
So, yeah, yesterday at the time of this live stream, it is February 5th. So we recorded on February 4th, 2021. But definitely go check out if you want a sort of more in-depth look at what I suggest people do. And there's so many different things that I could suggest on top of that. The number one thing that comes to mind as you've been talking about skill stacking is just to be yourself. So you've got to discover who you are. Do you want to be a sort of personality type ministry or apologetics channel? And if so, then you've got to figure out, okay, are you the type of person, is that what God is calling you to do, in other words?
Yes.
And I think that the best way to answer that question is to look at your credentials. Are you just like someone who's an autodidact, someone who's just like learned a bunch of stuff on your own? Or are you an actual expert in some particular field, right? Do you have a PhD? Do you have a master's? And so that's kind of the thing that I would look at is as you're looking at whether or not you want to be a kind of personality versus a platform-based ministry, that's probably the number one thing that I would look at there. But just be yourself, and you've got to find a way, because there are tons of different apologetics channels right now on YouTube, and there's only going to be more, and I think that's amazing. But what you've got to do is you don't want to be another William Lane Craig. You don't want to be another Cameron Bertuzzi. You don't want to be another Mike Winger. You've got to figure out who are you, and how can you incorporate that into your ministry, and how can you make it unique? How can you make it fun? If you like comedy, if you're funny, or if you like music, you've got to figure out what are you drawn to, and how can you incorporate that into what you're doing. And I think that a lot of people miss that, and so you end up just being like a less nice version of someone else who you're kind of someone that you maybe aspire to be, or someone that you look up to. And so, but there are definitely ways that you can incorporate. One of the things that I said that I was talking about maybe a year ago, and I still think about this from time to time, is if you're into gaming, start a gaming YouTube channel and talk about apologetics the whole time. Like, that would be amazing. If you're interested in playing games, why not? Like that seems perfect. And so don't run away from the other things that you're passionate about. Look for ways to incorporate those. And I think that once you do that, it's going to be a whole lot better in the long run. But that's probably the number one thing I would say is just to be yourself. That's so good. And I think you talked about the difference between like personality-driven platforms. So would you say like a Mike Winger, John McCrae are more of a personality channel? My channel is definitely a personality channel, whereas what you're talking about is, hey, you don't have to have this over-the-top credential or this over-the-top personality. You can be a curator. Would you agree with that? Kind of like John McCrae and Mike Winger are more personality-based? Yeah. I would say that they're definitely more personality-based. And it depends on, here's the thing with Mike Winger, though, is that he talks about a lot about the Bible. He's a pastor, so he's got a lot on those. But then he does still bring on people who are experts, and something like Sean McDowell, the person who you were reading. He had him on to talk about the persecution of the early Christians. And so on topics where his knowledge is limited, then he'll bring on the experts, and which is a completely legitimate thing to do. So you can have a kind of mixture. You can like to talk about things yourself. And you can even, if you want to go the personality route, you can, caveat some of the things that you say. Like this is just my thoughts as someone who's investigating this. And that doesn't mean that you're being arrogant or anything. You don't have to go that route. You can just, give your thoughts. Like John McCrae, that's what he does, is he will take some subject and some current event or something, and he'll just share his thoughts about it. And then that's what he does. And it's awesome. And it works really well for him. So, but yeah, I think that going back to like who you are and being true to yourself and figuring out like, what are you good at and what can you do? And what other things can you bring into apologetics, and how can you fuse those together? I think that's something that you've just really got to slow down and think about. Don't try to jump into it too quickly, because if you jump into it now and then you're like, oh, well, maybe in a year, I'll figure out who I am and what I want to do and stuff, then that's actually really bad for YouTube, because then your channel is all over the place and YouTube doesn't know who to send your videos to. So if you can start somewhere and have a really clear picture of who you are from the beginning, that's a much better way of going about it. I'm actually in the process of helping another Christian YouTuber who I'm going on his channel on Monday, and his name is Parker, or his YouTube channel is called Parker's Pensies, which is actually a really clever name after, and I can't even think of his name, but anyway, so I'm going on his channel, and his channel was kind of a hodgepodge. He had like these videos of he's I don't even know what you call it. He has African bullfrogs, and he like feeds them things, and that's what he has on his channel. And one of his videos has like almost 40 million views, where it's just like this frog eating all of these like bugs and even mice and stuff. And but so on that same channel, he was putting these like interviews, which these apologetic interviews are like, he was interviewing these philosophers. Yeah. And these interviews were amazing. He's got like 50,000 subscribers on this channel, but those videos were only getting like 100, 200 views, which doesn't make any sense for the number of subscribers that he had. And so I was convincing him, look, dude, you need to start a new channel completely devoted to these interviews and stuff. And you're going to miss out on your monetization. You're going to miss out on all the subscribers that you've got. But at least what you're going to do is start to build an audience that really cares about that specific type of content. And on YouTube, that is super important. If YouTube doesn't know who to send your videos to or to refer your videos to, then you're not going to get any views. And that's the way to grow a channel, is that YouTube has got to learn through algorithms and everything who the type of person to show your video to. And that's super important. If you're all over the place, if you have different kinds of content, then that's going to be a lot more difficult, actually. So yeah, I think it's important to really figure out and nail down who you are and what you want your channel to be about before you start it, before you try to post any videos. Like really nail that down first and do the hard work up front, as opposed to trying to like do it later on.
Yeah, that's good. I did it totally backwards. I just started making videos and talking about stuff I wanted to, and then over time, as I reflected on what I was most passionate on and most experienced on, which was faith-related topics and thinking through, faith stuff in terms of God and the Bible and current events and all that kind of stuff. As I found that pocket, it took me a while to find that pocket, because I initially was kind of doing more like motivational business advice from a Christian worldview, and then I went over and just said, I'm just going to talk about faith and my faith and the nuanced things of these social issues, politics, all that kind of stuff. Then is when it started to pick up. But it was the things that I didn't want to talk about that I knew I could talk about, and then it started to work out for me. And so it's interesting that you talk about knowing yourself.
Before you get into it.
Yeah, because if you don't know what you're talking about, or two, you just don't have self-awareness. You're not sure of like, what are you good at? What are you passionate about, right? What are your expertise? All that kind of stuff. So I think that's really good, man. I think that's going to add a lot of value. You guys definitely go check out his 7 tips for YouTube. It's on Capturing Christianity's channel. Also, Mike Winger has a whole separate channel dedicated to just Christian YouTube. That is freaking gold, man. It's so good. It's so good stuff. I go on there regularly and just kind of like, what's he talking about? Because he's definitely done a killer job on growing his platform. He just cracked 200,000 subs. You're at 80,000 subs. So I think this is a very fertile space, and it's very inspiring. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap?
No. I wish I did. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I wasn't really sure, Ruslan, I wasn't really sure what to expect. with a conversation with you, but it's been awesome. It's been just super chill, super conversational. So just, yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
And we didn't talk about politics.
We didn't.
Cameron, thank you so much. Guys, check out Cameron's channel. It's called Capturing Christianity. If you have questions, doubts, anything like that, I really feel like this channel will bless you. So check him out. I'll have that. It's pinned in the title. It'll be pinned in the description and on the pinned comment. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate you, Cameron. Thank you so much. This was fun. You are, I think what you're doing is really special, and I think it could be a blueprint for other creators who may not hold, status and have big personalities, but have a passion for something. So thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate you.
Joshua the king came down and bore it all. Yeah, conversations front of the fireplace. All of my mistakes, how do I erase? Wanna operate at a higher pace. Birth pains causing the body to dilate on a first name basis with the worst pain facing.